So our task and what we've been working on between the December reconvening of the think tank and the focus groups have been doing the deep analysis of the commentary and the feedback and being able to try and bring that into a structure that makes sense. I suspect there's not a lot of surprises in today because it has been, as you say, such an open process, and it's been reported at every phase, and many familiar faces in this room have been to a number of sessions. But what we haven't attempted to do in sort of framing the consultants' report is really reflect back what we've heard, but be able to put it into some sensible structure and try and create structure for the community to be able to move forward. The piece that I think we've probably brought our additional expertise to is thinking about, how much can you realistically sort of forecast to do at each step in time. So how would that sort of roadmap look in terms of a trajectory over time? And also we've made a few comments about what we think are critical issues for the community to think about going forward, right? So there's obviously a lot of material here is really the assimilation and the collection of the input of, as you say, thousands of people. But we have tried to bring some of our expertise and experience to that as well. The intention, obviously, for me, I mean, there are two sort of 50 to 60 page documents plus a data visualization portal. I'm not going to bore you with the whole lot, right? But I do really want to just give you the overarching structure to it and the framework to it, and then we can have, obviously, a discussion about that. But I think everybody's going to need the time to read it thoroughly and digest it and understand what it means going forward. I should say I really do appreciate the town staff who did actually help us sort of review the report, but only from a point of view of picking up acronyms and making sure that language was appropriate and that I spelt neighbourhoods correctly and things like that. That's the advantage that they have that I don't because I'm not the local. But so very much this is the consultant's report and reflects our views and thoughts and recommendations to yourself as a community. So with that, Sandy, am I good to sort of dive into this?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
And I probably want to take about, I guess it's going to take, say, 30 or so, 40 minutes to go through. I want to sort of both give you the framework, but obviously I think you're going to have a lot of questions. And because there is so much detail in this, it's not feasible for me to be able to point to every topic, right? So I can really only talk to the high level components of this, and then I think we can investigate that in some questions. All right, so I'm going to go through a series of slides and whichever screen, I hope they will be visible enough, so whichever way you want to look, I'll talk to that screen because that's the one in front of me. In terms of the products, and I will talk about the timeline, as you said, Sandy, this is a very exciting kind of moment because we are sort of reaching that sort of point of conclusion in certainly the part that we've been involved in. And you can see there's some quite substantial products that I think have been produced through this. So it started with the community profile and benchmark analysis that was produced in May. We had the think tank scenario-based workshop in June, and I know a number of people here were part of that. That's been published for quite a while. There's the portal, which I'll come back to in a moment. And today we're producing or talking about the community engagement report, which is our summary analysis of all the community engagement, and then talking about the vision and the strategic plan. So that's sort of laying out the roadmap going forward. I do want to make a note about the portal. So I'm sure a lot of people going, when do I get to see these reports? Well, at about 3 o'clock, they're going to be posted on the portal, right? So they'll be there available to download. And there will also be a survey that you can take that I will talk about towards the end of my comments here. The portal does have all the data now loaded, and I know many people have been looking at the data visualization platform. That's actually a much richer source or insight into the community commentary than the engagement report because it's a more static presentation. In the portal you can tease it out, but I want to sort of walk through some of the functionality of that. So I want to start with the community engagement report. So this is really trying to sort of put a ring fence around the community dialogue from the get-go up to and including the reconvening of the think tank in December and the focus group sessions we had. And to to the amount that we can possibly do realistically in a report, we have included the summaries of all the discussion. You know, one of the things that was the mandate from yourselves as a Vision Project Management team, open and inclusive and transparent. So in the spirit of that, we have written a long report, but we have tried to structure this so that it has, you can go to references and see what people said in different parts. You can see what different focus groups said, what different conversations were about, and see how that conversation evolved through the course of the project. And I want to do, if I could, Sandy, just for people, not everybody may have been right through the whole process, I want to just sort of recap on some of the methodology, but quickly, right? So we want to get to the guts of it. So obviously the sort of structural relationship of this whole process, it's been hosted and initiated by the Town Council, so they're at the top, you know, the Public Planning Committee, that's ultimately where this ends up. At the bottom, and it's not intended to be in any way sort of hierarchical, but the bottom is the public at large, right? And that's really been the big driver in this discussion. It has been the opportunity, which many of you took the advantage of, to have your voice into shaping thoughts about the future. So that covers the think tank, the surveys, the engagement workshops, focus groups and so on. And then at the operational level, it was really the collaboration between the Vision Project Management team providing guidance, the town staff doing a lot of the heavy lift on logistics and material preparation, and then Future IQ as the consultants who designed and facilitated much of the process. So to recap on the timeline, sort of left to right, you know, we started in March, run through to today, 15th of February, 16th of February. And we went through some basic large steps there, which was the initial research. That was when the benchmark report was produced. We did the think tank, as I mentioned. Then we moved into the community engagement and workshops, which was August to October. The reconvening of the think tank in November, December. And then obviously the work we've been doing since is to make sense of all that. That diagram shows you the products at the bottom and the major steps of community engagement at the top. So the bottom pieces are reports or portals that have been produced as this. One of the things that I think is a really good feature of this project, if I could make some comments like that as I go through, is that this has not been a black box, you know, process. This is not where you all had a say and it disappeared into a box and then out the end pops. You know, we're committed that you can draw a direct line between your comments, whether it was made back there in, you know, June or wherever, and you can draw a line and see how that materialises or connects into the final component. That's why there's so many products out of this, because we wanted to absolutely honour and reflect your contribution. Because I think, you know, if we're going to talk about a vision that's looking out to, you know, decades into the future, this is going to be your resource material to come back to, you know, and to think about as you go through implementation, you know, not to lose all those ideas that came up in the discussion, but be able to kind of revisit those and build those into thinking going forward. Just so then at the level of metrics, this just is some of the sort of high level of the input. The larger circle there was the community surveys. We had over 2,500 people start that. The vast majority finished it, but you know, that represented, you know, some thousands of hours of community input. And starting at the top, I'll just run through that so it's sort of logical, although it's not actually sequential. There were the kiosks and the open town hall platforms that the town staff provided. We had hundreds of responses in those. Quite honestly, the responses were interesting, but they're not really substantive, and that sort of process is not designed for that. I mean, that's just, you know, somebody dumping an idea into a box, right? You're not, you know, it's not a PhD going into the box. It's a top of mind idea, but that was all captioned. We had a number of focus groups in December and more recently, which was key sort of target groups that came together. The reconvening of the think tank, we had 130 people. That was for a sort of afternoon and evening. We'll talk about their work today. The community engagement sessions was one of the big kind of backbones of this. We had 24 workshops. Close to 1,000 people attended those workshops, and they were typically sort of an hour and a half to 2 hours long. So that's a really substantial community turnout. had 150 people at the think tank workshop, and we had just on 700 very detailed surveys completed from the community engagement. And those mechanisms were either people who did it at the workshop or took it home and handed it in, or some people did it online. We provided a couple of different accesses for that. But that's the numbers. On any measure, that's a really solid engagement process. I mean, even on a community of this size, and I think you should really applaud yourself for being the kind of passionate people who turn out, right? So, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. In terms of the data, one of the things, as I said, we were very committed to a sort of a transparent but usable data set. So as you go, if you haven't been on the portal, as you go there, you'll be able to look at all the data about the profile of respondents and look at different cohort views, and that's just one I grabbed as an example. The community engagement report is full of these sort of metrics in terms of age breakdowns and where people live. So that's a great resource. Then in terms of the focus groups, which we held in December, there was focus groups around sustainability and environmental resilience. We had restaurants, resorts, recreation, entertainment groups come together, faith-based philanthropic community group, focus group, education, Native Islander and Gullah Geechee focus group, real estate, gated communities, construction. So sort of big broad buckets, right? And that helped us add a little bit more depth to the discussions that were coming out of the reconvening of the think tank. So, and their comments are reported in full in the community engagement report. You can go to it's pretty much laid out in a sequential order, so you can go to the back of that and see what they said. All right, so sort of moving a little to now thinking a bit about moving to the vision and the strategic action plan. And Sandy, if you want to interrupt me, just let me know, right? So.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And anyone feel free if there are questions along the way, if you're good with that, David.
Yeah, fine. And I mean, there may be some logic in sort of getting to the end, because if I'm good, I'll hopefully address a lot of your questions on the way through. But if there are any sort of points of clarification, that'd be very handy. So this is the framework that really is the underpinning methodology of this. So obviously at the start of this, it's very apparent that Hilton Head Island is a very fascinating and complex community. You have a remarkable history, all sorts of different layers in that. You have a really intriguing social fabric in terms of the way people are distributed and how people got here. And so we knew that the task to think deeply about a future would have to be very robust and would have to be really good methodology, right? So it was built on scenario planning, which was the work of the think tank. And basically that group looked at what were a range of plausible futures for the island, and plausible being the right word. So we're not talking fantasy, we're talking things that are within the scope of plausibility as in reality. And the engagement that ensued after that was really drilling into whereabouts in this sort of future canvas do we want to end up, right? And I know many of you have seen that sort of matrix, so I won't go through that, but roughly speaking, just if you aren't familiar with this, roughly speaking, the bottom left-hand corner sort of represents a future of not quite least change, but certainly a future that would play out if we didn't change very much, like a status quo type of future. The top right-hand corner sort of represents a future where there'd be more proactive change, like probably at the maximum at the top right, but they're gradients. Those big axes and scales there are intended to be continuums. Roughly speaking, as we go up the scale, we're looking at more redevelopment, more economic diversification in the economy over time. As we go across the diagram, we're talking about left to right, a more inclusive, multi-generational sort of community or multi-dimensional community on the right. So on the left, it's a focus on destination. On the right, it's a focus on the inclusive multi-dimensional. On the bottom, on the vertical axis, the bottom is protecting traditional strengths. At the top is like a revitalisation, modernisation. So that's all I'm going to say. And if you're not familiar with this, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to read the report, right? But this is a really foundational piece to the thinking and the dialogue that followed. So I want to turn, if I can, to the vision and strategic action plan report. Because again, I want to just go through the high-level components. So the whole point of this, right, is at the bottom of that diagram, which is a data-driven, consensus-based vision. Okay, so what was very clear was that we needed to have something that was robust. You know, a visioning process in a community is not just who shouts the loudest. You know, so we wanted to build a very strong data-based, data-driven process so that people could see the logic, you know, that gets built over time. And we were looking for a consensus, like a point of consensus in terms of what's the aspirational future that the people in this community share. And so that sort of inverted pyramid sort of reflects that we took the scenario planning think tank sort of output at the top, and we kept working that down and sort of finessing that and trying to refine where's this data-driven, consensus-based vision, what's that point in the future look like? So I want to, and if many of you would know this, but we were really using the sort of heat map principle. Just to refresh us all, because I think this is really important data for the next step. This is the outcomes at the level of what we call the expected future. So expected future is what would happen or where would we end up if we don't do anything different, okay? And so these concentrations of colour, the deeper the colour or the bigger the number, and they're exactly the same correlation, that shows the greater number of people on that point, right? So if you look at this one on the left-hand chart with the squares on it, that's the output from the think tank, and we didn't show anybody this until after the community had buy-in, right? We didn't want to bias it, but that's where they landed at the end of the think tank. And the chart on the right, which is on the data visualization platform or portal, that's the results from the 700 community surveys. So what you can see, two things, right? One is a very high correlation between the think tank and the community engagement results. The chart on the right, those circles are a first level of averaging, so we just take a little bit of the noise out. So they're cohorts, which is gender, age and ethnicity kind of cohorts, right? But you can see that there's this repeated concentration and clustering. So somewhere in that safe harbour is what people saw, and pretty much we can get it down to a cell or two within that matrix of where people pretty much share the view of where this island would end up if you don't do anything different, right? And the implications of that are spelled out in the scenario planning report and in the vision survey. Probably more interesting is what's the preferred future, right? So that was and this is the basis of the vision. So obviously when you find a point of consensus around a preferred future, that's your vision, right? That becomes your vision point. On the chart on the left is with the square boxes, that's what the think tank group landed on. And the chart on the right is the 700 community surveys, right? So two things to note, or three things actually to note. One is almost all the responses are within the scenario space called reinventing sustainability again. Okay, and you can actually go on the portal and filter out that by different cohorts, and we'll talk a little about that, right? So that gives us the scenario space. The other thing to note is that the two groups are quite close in correlation. A little bit of sort of a toning back from aspiration from the community engagements versus the think tank. That's actually not surprising because the think tank participants invented the scenarios and they spent a whole day on it, and so they're going to be a little bit more vested and naturally more kind of gung-ho about it than people who may have a shorter exposure to it. The third thing to really note is there's a gap between the preferred and expected, which we'll talk about. So one thing is we know, and what's important about the gap is how big it is and in what direction is it moving. Okay, so that tells us a lot about what we need to think about as we talk about an action plan, which is what I'll get to. But there's one thing to talk about a vision where I just get the pick, right? You know, here's the canvas and I'm just going to pick here, right? And obviously that produces a sort of an aspirational result. In a community like this, it's really important to think about and understand, or try and understand, is behaviour going to match that aspiration? So it's one thing to say, for example, we don't want X to happen, or we do want X to happen, but when push comes to shove, are people going to make that? Are they going to make the investments or the decisions? And, you know, you can just look at some of the public debates that are happening right now, right? between what people want and what people are willing to do, right? So, and if there's a big cognitive dissonance in that, then you have an issue, which means you're not going to move forward properly, right? Or you're going to have frustration. So what this chart's looking at is we asked people a series of 8 questions, which were 4 questions on each of those axes, so the X and the Y, and they were subset questions, and people were presented with a response scale or a sensitivity scale that reflected the axis and the extremes on the end, or the endpoints. And we weren't telling people we were doing this. So this is a way for us to kind of validate, are people going to make decisions that are consistent with, in a cumulative sense, consistent with their aspiration? And that's all the data. So we haven't done a first level of averaging. That's just all the data. The bigger the dots just means there's more people on that spot. And what we did was we took those 8 responses and recombined them to create an XY point, right? So the 4 questions that were associated with the horizontal axis, we recombined their responses, created an average which became the X and then the Y. And so a couple of things to note, right? Well, one is we have a spread, right? Well, we know that, right? There's, people at far left corner, people at the far top right corner. Not unusual. And it's not unusual to see that sort of line running through that sort of horizontal axis, because typically people who have an appetite for change will have an appetite for change on multiple dimensions. Okay, just typically, right? So that's what drives that sort of line. But if you look, you have somebody down in the bottom right. Okay, see that dot down there? So that's somebody who has a lot of appetite for change on the horizontal axis, but no appetite for change on the vertical axis. So you can sort of tease that out, right? There's also a very strong concentration around what also reflects the preferred future, right? So clearly there's noise, right? And we want to understand that. But if you look at where the average is, or the consensus point, it very much mirrors the preferred future in the previous approach. But not everybody's the same, right? So you can play with this. This will be fascinating for you. You can go onto the data visualization portal and you can look at people's responses on that type of chart by all sorts of categories. So you can filter it out by age, ethnicity, where people live, gender, how long they've been associated with the island, and their cumulative filters. So you can kind of build up, ever sort of focused criteria, if you want to look at it. We'll run out of data quicker than you'll run out of fun, because even though there's 700 there, you can start to filter this down and you'll lose people pretty fast. There's 2 big cohorts in this data set that I want to talk about, right? And we touched on this at the reconvening of the think tank, but I just want to go back over it because I think it's important to set the stage for the action plan.
David, before you start, I'm going to just mention, because we have some guests in the back and you're welcome, there are some seats up front. I just wanted you to be aware of that and give you a chance to take a sip of water.
Thanks. All right. So the 2 big cohort splits in this community, right? So I'm not sure, are we taking questions from the audience?
And yeah, we'll have citizen comment at the end.
The chart to the left is from the base, is people who are in that safe harbor kind of cluster, how happy they are with that.
About to explain that. Yes.
Okay, and then secondly, you were talking about the propensity for those people who like to have that. So if you're looking at the chart to the right, is this the propensity of the people?
So let me explain, right? So if I understand, but let me explain.
Let's just agree on this. We'll certainly answer this question, and then we'd like to have citizens' comments at the end for the agenda. Thank you, David.
Okay.
You don't understand the data, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not being adversarial here. I'm simply saying I don't understand.
Yeah. I'm about to explain. Just give me a moment, right? So what we're looking at here, right, is, so you're able to go into this data set and you can do this. And I just picked out 2, right, that are interesting to look at. So, but the 2 big cohorts to play with and think about, both at the level of this visualization, which is the recombined data, but at the individual question level, because that's also on the platform. The 2 big cohorts are around age. So people who are, and I don't know if we call them younger, but people who are 10 to 50 have a very similar view, okay, in terms of appetite for change and response around issues. That's distinctly different from 60 to the end of the scale, right? And the 50 to 60s are sort of somewhere in between. But there's two big cohorts, and you'll see it repeatedly through the data in terms of appetite for change or reaction to issues. The other big splitter is there's clearly a different view, and I'll show you some of this data, of people who live in gated communities and people who live outside the gated communities. That's a very distinct, and it's more intense in some of the questions than others. Not surprising, right? But I think it's really important as we think about strategic action plan that we understand that, right? Because that's the dynamic that's under the surface. So these two charts are two that I just picked out. And the one on the left, where you can see that the concentration is more predominantly down in the safe harbour quadrant on the lower left, that's people who live in Port Royal Plantation. Okay, so I just pulled them out. So that's everybody who lives in Port Royal. There's no age filtering or anything on that, right? But you'll see it in some of the other cohorts as well. The chart on the right is all the people who are 10 to 50. 10 to 50 years of age, right? So that's what I mean about the younger cohort. They have obviously a concentration or an appetite to that upper right quadrant, and remembering that the kind of continuum of change sort of goes bottom left to top right. Again, probably not super surprising, but it's really good, I think, to be able to quantify this and understand it in terms of decision making going forward. Because clearly there are going to be pockets in this community where people are going to have more or less compelling need or appetite for change, and I think understanding that's important. You can also look at this in terms of ethnic breakdown, or how long people have been associated with the island and so on, right? But that's just some high-level comments there. And how this plays out at the individual sort of issue level. So I picked one of the 8 sliding questions, and this one was around residential fabric. So this is all the data. You'll see on that side there, on the right-hand side, you'll see all the filter charts there. There's age group, gender, ethnicity, self-description. That's what people are most interested in, where they currently live, gated, not gated, years living on Hilton Head Island. They're your filters, right, to play with. So this is all the data, and the question is about residential fabric. And the scale was, when we look to the future, what would you like it to be like? 1, which is on the left-hand side, is strongly retain the exclusive and select residential focus. Okay, and 10, which is on the right-hand side, is a more diverse residential and neighbourhood options. Okay, so 1 to 10, right? So that's the scale. That's all the data. But if we break this out, and you can play with the filters yourself, but this is the gated community response, right? So you can see that that's very strongly skewed towards strongly retain the exclusive and select residential focus. If you go to the other side, which is the not gated community, then you have a very different distribution. Okay, and I think understanding this and being able to quantify it, it's a really key issue for this community to be able to wrestle with, because I imagine that data would tell me that you could probably have a lot of polarised views around topics, and so that's the laughter recognition. So, and if you're having polarised views, sometimes that can bog down progress because we're not able to find consensus or find the way to move forward. And not every decision has to affect every component of the island. I mean, one of the things that is unique is you have different layers of governance here. I mean, you have housing associations that have very clear governance and control over what happens within their territory or jurisdiction, and then you have, a town who has a broader kind of view of the island and so on. But understanding these nuances is going to be really important, right? So, and if you look at that, I mean, that's, so if you look at the average data, you go, well, we're not really sure, but then here you have a whole different level of clarity, and that is just the filter that looks at gated, not gated, okay? So that's all there on the portal, and it's in the community engagement report. So with that, right, so I want to then sort of bring us now moving towards the vision and the action plan, is that this was the data from the reconvening of the think tank. And we're using the sort of preferred future matrix here. We showed a lot of this data to briefly to the reconvening think tank, which was a lot of the original participants in the think tank, and then some additional people who came who sort of got excited by the process in the engagement workshops and applied to come to the reconvening. We asked people then to sort of reconcile this, because clearly, if you go back, we have some sort of concentrations here We have, we know that there's a spread underneath. We know there are different cohorts. How do we reconcile this, right? And think about where are we putting the flag in the sand for the future? And there was a couple of criteria. So we said, well, take into account everything you've seen, right? In terms of the data, but also we have to think about, we're talking about 2040. So that's 22 years from now. And if you think of those cohort age responses, everybody's going to be 22 years older, and the world will have evolved 22 years. So we know societal values are shifting. We know technology is changing. So how does that change? Where do we peg our future? And so at the reconvening of the think tank, this was the response to that question. You can see again that sort of concentration, right up there in the centre, even upper right, sort of the reinventing sustainability again. So 3 levels of validation, which I think is pretty strong, that we understand where the sort of sense of a preferred future is by the vast majority in the consensus. Not everybody, of course, but by certainly the concentration. We also asked at the reconvening of the think tank about prioritisation around key topics, and we ran this issue of key topics or themes right through the engagement process. We were trying to continually understand these issues around environmental focus, transportation infrastructure, workforce patterns, economic focus, healthy ageing, nature of tourism, and so on, because these feed directly into the strategic action plan. So we wanted to understand. This was the prioritisation. This is in the community engagement report, and the darker the colour, the bigger the number, is the greatest sort of concentration of prioritisation, the darker being the highest priority. The column on the right-hand side is just the totals across the horizontal line. But you can see that, and we asked people about when do these things need to be acted upon, and there's sort of now 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 20 and so on. You can see, a lot of stuff right now or fairly soon, right? And there's a recurrent theme through all the data about this sense of urgency, and I'll show you some of that data like in summary, but there's really a sense of we need to get on with this, right? It's a good time to be thinking about our future, but we need to act on this. And you can see some of the prioritisations there. Okay, so starting to pivot to think about the roadmap, right? So this is, if you just sort of conceptually take this case that we have pretty clear understanding about expected future, high levels of alignment and validated in a couple of different ways, preferred future, very similar. You have continued sort of layers of validation that's basically coming back to the same issue at the level of the majority. Then closing that gap is the issue for the strategic action plan. So the preferred future represents the vision, and we talk a little about that in the vision report. But then how do we close that gap? Because that is quite a large gap over a trajectory in terms of implications of what the outcome would look like. And the direction is on both axes. So we are talking about a strong desire for change at the level of the cultural character and social fabric, moving to a more inclusive, multidimensional community, very strong movement in that direction, and a strong movement in the vertical direction, which is moving from protecting traditional strengths to revitalising and modernising. I would probably argue, and I think the reconvening of the think tank recognised, is the top right-hand scenario represents quite a challenging future. It's going to require you dealing with a lot of the tough issues that don't get dealt with. But that's what it's going to take. And I'm going to talk about the action plan and sort of frame that out a little bit. And I think as I go through this, I'm going to invite you to think about what do we need to change as an island in order to be able to fulfil on that trajectory. Because clearly keep doing what you're doing is not, by your own assessment, right? So what is it that you're going to have to think about as a community to be able to make that very clear and quite strong shift? We also, just to round out the sort of data set before I get to the strategic action framework, we asked people about what do you think are the values that should represent the community of Hilton Head Island in 2040. And this is a categorisation that we did of people's responses, and you can see some very strong issues that actually are very reinforcing to the preferred future. So sustainability in whatever version comes out as a very strong core value. and that's, if you think of the scenario name, it's, reinventing sustainability again. It's a core issue. I do think there are some blind spots about sustainability that I want to talk to, where I think that you might be living on the coattails of some investments that have been done before rather than being at the forefront, but I'll talk about that. But then you look at the next ones, there's inclusivity, diversity, family-friendly, moving sort of down the line. They're very consistent with that shift on the horizontal axis towards a more inclusive, multi-dimensional community. Then we talk about beauty of the island, world-class destination, forward thinking and so on, and that sort of reflects a lot of what's the strength of your brand. All right, so what we've tried to do, and this is where we sort of move from the data that was produced directly from the community engagement to, as a consultant's report, we think about how do you put all this together in some sort of a sensible plan going forward. Knowing full well that everybody seems to want everything done straight away, but I think we're all kind of been around the block enough times to realise that's probably unrealistic. But we do want to have a coherent pathway. That's going to be the important thing, is that there's a sense of things are building on each other as we move forward, and we have the courage to address some of the big issues that are going to be make or break, right? So that's sort of a little of the context of this, right? So this is the framework that we're going to talk through, and there's a couple of slides to sort of explain this. And this is, as I said, this is our sort of moving it from the strict data to try and put it into some coherent structure. So the Vision 2040, reinventing sustainability, again, that's in the middle. And around that are what we call 7 key strategic pillars. And I'll explain how they got built up, and that's also in the report. And you'll notice that a lot of our diagrams, what we try and do is talk about a systems type approach. And I think that's really important to understand, because if you think about the big issues that were identified early on, things like workforce housing, workforce availability, transportation issues, congestion issues, they're all really interrelated. So you have to take a kind of an organic or interrelated approach to think about how do you tackle these things, because obviously, a large inbound commuter workforce is part of your congestion issue and so on, right? Or the lack of available affordable housing, creates that, because people are ending up having to locate, some distance from the, and so this is what this tries to tackle. And I'll start at the top and go around, and I'm trying to indicate that these strategic pillars, if you get it right, can be sort of reinforcing. So you're trying to create a sort of a synergistic an effect where investment in one area supports or mobilises investment in other areas and activity and so on. I'm not saying it's the perfect model, and I'm not trying to say it's linear, right? But I am saying these things are, connected, and they do impact each other. So I'll start at the top, right? So the relentless pursuit of excellence, and that's what we're proposing as a strategic pillar. And it's really interesting sort of a concept, I think, and what emerged for us in terms of standing in front of literally 1,000+ people on this community and having really quite important conversations, is that the sense is that people are not satisfied that Hilton Head Island's merely good. People want it to be great, or to be extraordinary or exceptional. Many people here came here because of a very renowned brand. And I think as a contextual behaviour, we're sort of proposing that as a strategic pillar, because I think that's going to define how you might resolve some of the tough issues going forward. It's also a thread, actually, because we've been looking at what's the threads. It's a thread that really goes back over decades to both some of the founding concepts of the modern era of development. It's in previous visionary sort of documents in one form or another. But I think calling this out and thinking about how do we function at the level of excellence is important. And I don't just mean a nice coat of paint. I'm talking about, as a community, that you have a focus on doing things as good as you can. And I want to address later on, and I'll kind of weave this in now, but I think there are some sort of behaviours in the fabric of this community where it's a bit destructive, right? You know, it's like in terms of people pretty challenging about sort of decision making, and there's sort of like a tendency to go after each other a little bit. That to me is not a pursuit of excellence. That'll run you down to the lowest common denominator. You know, and the vision that is being articulated is going to require excellence in almost every dimension, if not every dimension. So it's just, we're going to peg that out there as sort of an overarching philosophy. The next two strategic pillars moving around, the next three really are built directly from the scenario matrix. So one is about redefining environmental sustainability. And right in the middle, of course, is the name of the preferred future, Reinventing Sustainability Again. There's that scenario, and the details about that are in the reports. But it's arguable that there was probably a very strong reputation for sustainability in this community. Okay, the Charles Fraser dream or vision, you know, the ecological landscape protection, so on, that's been a very founding value. But as we discussed at the community engagement sessions, you probably would have difficulty claiming that Hilton Head Island is at the very forefront of sustainability today. If you think about it in terms of all the other dimensions of sustainability, you know, energy management, water systems, ecological health, you know, I see you've just recently banned plastic bags, right? But that's really like the tip of the story, right? So if we're going to be really making a mark for ourselves about sustainability, then I think there's going to be a requirement for us not to kid ourselves, but to really say we need to redefine what does sustainability mean to us, and broaden that focus and that lens to really think about all those issues about transportation, you know, modes of transportation, you know, carbon footprint impacts, you know, some of those kind of bigger issues. So that's sort of a key strategic pillar. Otherwise, I pretty much would predict this, and I think I can say this as I'm delivering the consultant's report, is, you know, you're living off the investment that occurred before. You know, you're living off the investment and the vision of something that was founded decades and decades ago, right? And if you're serious about reinventing sustainability again, I mean, I think you better than any community can recapture that and be the type of community that leads the story into the future about what does sustainability mean in a community in today's world in 2020, 2030 and 2040, okay? But there's all sorts of implications that come with that, right? Which is, you know, start with the simple stuff, plastic bags, straws and all those things. But then there's a whole raft of things there to be really thinking about. I mean, there's issues about community sustainability and the future of, you know, the Gullah Geechee culture and things like that. And we touch on that in the vision report. So the bigger picture redefines environmental sustainability, but really what we're talking about is sustainability there. The next strategic pillar is about revitalising and modernising the economy. That's the vertical axis. That is something that is just fundamental to being able to achieve the preferred future, because it's one of the two big defining axes. There's an enormous world in that whole story, you know, in terms of thinking about how do you trigger the next wave of economic development. And it's in a context where your history over decades has been based on growth. You know, development growth, tourism growth, population growth. But the early work that we did, the survey work, and it was reinforced through it, there's little appetite expressed by the community about continued trajectory of population and development growth. Okay, so you're smart enough to know that if you don't then think about, or you're going to get into a stagnation situation if we don't think about how do we, you know, maybe, you know, there's the aspiration that we're not going to just keep maxing out and end up with, you know, whatever, millions of tourists and hundreds of thousands of people or whatever, but how do we build vitality, right? And so the experience that elsewhere and what's defined in the scenario matrix is this revitalisation and modernising the economy could be a very fruitful pathway, right? But it will require different thinking. Right? Require a different way to approach economic development, you know, different types of businesses that would be here and so on. You're very strong, for example, if you look at the benchmark analysis, you're very strong in some areas like, you know, food services sectors and recreation, construction and those type of things. Well, you know, what are the other sort of economic categories that would be part of revitalisation and modernisation if that was occurring? The fourth one is fostering an inclusive multidimensional community. That's the horizontal axis. So that's the move from a destination community to a more inclusive multi-generational community, multi-dimensional community. That's a really critical strategic pillar, and I think that's going to be very challenging to think about implementation going forward, because this is I don't know what you'd say. It's an expensive community. Most people would argue. A lot of what we heard is why we don't have a multi-dimensional community is because a lot of people who work here can't afford to live here. So if that's something you want, how do you achieve that? And I know the town, for example, is doing some affordable housing studies and things like that. But how do you retain or build a really multi-dimensional community? If that's something that's baked right into your visioning process, how do you accomplish that? That's a major strategic pillar. The next one around is building a connected and collaborative community fabric. And this one kind of starts to tilt to the future, right? So, and it's got two dimensions to it. So one is the physical connectivity and one is the behaviour of being connected sort of virtually and collaboratively. So if you look at, say, the first four pillars and the vision, that's going to require, I would argue, people to find the way to work together in different ways and be able to draw in resources and experts from all over the place to be able to solve your grand challenges. Okay? So to do that, you have to have platforms for dialogue and constructive thought and idea generation and execution and so on. So that's part of the sort of the connected, but in a sort of a virtual sense, but also the connected at the level of community fabric. One of the issues that was recurrent in the engagement sessions was this concern that there are these barriers to moving around the island, right? And because you have structures of gated communities, right, where you can't get in, right, unless you're either paying or you're invited. And the issue about that, and that's a really sensitive issue, and I understand that, right? So because that's tied up with people's perception of safety and what they came here for and so on, and we heard all that, and you can see that in the data. But I think what this is trying to tilt towards is where is society going? And what might have been appealing 10 years ago or 20 years ago or even today may be different as generations move through the system. So that was part of what certainly the think tank and some of the other younger kind of participants in the engagement session talked about, is that the fabric needs to evolve. People want to be able to, younger people want to be able to socialise in different ways. You can see the macro trends in movement towards neighbourhoods, or what we call community nodes in the report. Those spots where people come and connect, and it might be the coffee shop or the amenity centre or the recreation centre or the cultural centre, whatever they are. There are these points where people gather in a community, right? So there's an evolution to occur in that. The next one around is expanding to embrace an integrated regional focus, and this is interesting. And I know this community's been starting to look at that. It's a real pivot point, I think, because when this development first started here, there was really nothing between here and back whoop whoop on the road, right? Whereas today it's Hilton Head without the island almost all the way, right, to the interstate. So you've had a lot of this sort of concentration occurring around you, and you're no longer insulated or isolated as you once were. Your workforce is very inbound. Your infrastructure issues are tied into the regional landscape. But I think there's some really interesting opportunities here, right? Because if we look at the trends, where agility and success is arriving is in large and regional consortiums, which can be towns and cities and communities coming together, that are able to adapt and grab hold of opportunities. Here, your big issues around workforce, transportation, infrastructure are going to require regional solutions. Your issues around macro changes in the environment, weather patterns, threats of hurricanes, all those things, they're all tied up, very intricately into a regional thing. So, we've proposed that if you get the trajectory right, you can become a really substantial player. I personally believe that you could position your island in an international level in terms of the next iteration of what it could be, right? And I want to talk about that, right? Then the last one, right, is the innovative approach to right-sized infrastructure, or to create right-sized infrastructure. That's the strategic pillar. The issue that's underpinning this is that infrastructure is embedded through everything. Everybody wants the problem fixed right now, okay? But the reality is, even if you said, we want to double the size of the bridge, how long does that take from, you know, planning, environmental approvals, funding cycles? It's like years away, right? And in that time frame, technology is going to change the game. So, for example, you know, what's the impact of autonomous vehicles? What's the impact of some of those type of changes that are coming down the system at us, right? So this concept of right-sized infrastructure is trying to think out forecast, and how do you get, you know, rather than chase an infrastructure model that might have made sense 10 years ago, how do you chase an infrastructure model that makes sense in 10 years' time? And in fact, you can look at investment in mass transit type things. In fact, many cities are doing things like saying, we don't want to tie up capital now in very expensive infrastructure because we think the story's going to change. Okay, so so I think that whole concept of this right-sized becomes really important, and it really ties into a lot of what we've talked about. All right, so they're the strategic pillars, right? And I've done as well as I can, I think, to try and explain where they came from and how they tie together. But these are overlapping and feed off each other and so on. But we've tried to cover the framework of the scenario planning, the overlying context of excellence, and then some of those key topics. In the report, these pillars are treated with several pages each, and we've tried to weave in all the, connect all the narrative we've heard in the engagement sessions to sort of, so you can find the place. So if you were talking about something in the engagement session or in one of the surveys, you'll find that located in one of these pillars. All right, and just to try and, in a very simple way, give you a diagrammatic representation, the way I would encourage you to think about this is that this is your machinery of the vision is going to be driven by these cogs, but they are not independent, right? So the systems type thinking ties all these strategic elements together in a very strong way. The issue with that is that if you have a missing cog, the machinery won't work. Okay, so I think to achieve the vision of reinventing sustainability again, you have to think about what are the fundamental things you need to have in play and make sure they happen concurrently. Because if you miss a key piece, then you may try really hard on others, but they may just not deliver the result that you're anticipating. All right, so now, underneath the strategic pillars, we've also, and I'm going to lead into a roadmap, right? So we tried to then surface up some subsets of key issues, right? And I'll move through this fairly fast, and allocate them to sort of give a little bit more flavour. And then in the roadmap I'll show you, we take these sort of subset big ideas or actions, right? Because we're now talking about the actions, and we sort of lay that out and say, well, how would that look in a 20-year time frame, and what sort of scale are we trying to work at? So if you take the relentless pursuit of excellence, we're talking about the island adopting the ideal of excellence, but doing it explicitly. I suspect it's implicit for a lot of people, right? But explicitly stating that that's what you're about. That's one of your defining metrics. In the longer term, I do believe that you have the opportunity to create yourself as an epicentre for excellence on a national and international scale. And I'll talk about what those opportunities are, I think, around some of your, how you work together as a community, some of your solutions to environmental issues, some of the issues around the cultural fabric and the Gullah Geechee community and its sort of future. I think all of those things are opportunities for you to be showcasing excellence that could be a model for other communities in the world and in this country. And I don't think it's audacious to say that, because that seems to be resonate with people, that there's a desire that that's who you want to be. You don't want to just be Myrtle Beach, or you want to be something better or different. So redefining the environmental sustainability. First step, redefine the sustainability. What do we mean by that? One of the issues that we've sort of pulled out is in a very practical way, is creating a renewable energy framework. I mean, that renewable energy, key driver, you know, in a consumption society. I mean, you have enough, you know, indigenous resources here to be, you know, to be at the forefront of that. And if you're going to be serious about sustainability, you've got to deal with that, right? That's just like, that's your table stakes. That's like, you don't get a seat at the table if you don't have a really decent renewable energy framework. There's also then the potential, I think, further down the track to become a location for unique environmental ecosystem research. You have a fascinating maritime, marine environment. You're a barrier island, and we know the issues about barrier islands. I think, and certainly it came through in the engagement processes and in the discussion, a lot of interest in this idea of how do you position yourself as the place where really interesting research and practical application occurs around what's part of your core value, and as a part of your vision is the environmental ecosystem research. So under the revitalising and modernising the economy, this is going to be, there's a balance point in this, right? Because you have a very big driver, which is tourism. You know, 2.67 million people. It's been really the underpinning driver for a lot of the development here. If people are saying, well, we get sort of getting close to the limit of that and so on, and we don't want to just, you know, keep sort of running that, well, what are you going to do? Because you don't want to shoot yourself in your own foot. But people talked a lot about how might we be able to tap into different types of tourism and deepen and widen that tourism economy. To do that, you really need to understand what are the emergent tourism trends. You know, because we're getting to a point internationally where desirable locations for the first time are now starting to hit the point where they're actually ruining themselves. And you see now communities putting in measures to limit the number of people, for example. You know, and that for the first time in history that occurred in a number of locations in Europe, the Cinque Terre and others. They're saying we're putting a cap on the number of people because it's starting to destroy our own fabric here. So we're proposing that as a first step, and these actually run through sort of sequentially, and I'll lay this out in the roadmap. Focus on restoration and revitalisation sounds easy, but it's actually a fair bit more complex. But really thinking about how do you enable policies for, you know, redevelopment to occur that might be, you know, picking up some of these core values, different kinds of materials, environmental sustainability. If you're going to refurbish or revitalise, then do it so that it's meeting all the, or ahead of all the current standards, you know. But that, by the way, is a world of entrepreneurial activity. That's the opportunity for the maker culture, for craftsmen and artisans and you know, small scale, you know, sort of business operators to come in and be part of, you know, driving economic restoration economy in the physical sense. Building the relevance to young professionals, really critical. We heard a lot about you're losing the game to Bluffton in terms of young professional businesses relocating. If you want to have a vibrant business sector, then you need to ensure you're relevant. And then further out, and this was further out because it was prioritised a little bit lower, but I think you have time on your side, is thinking about how do you really build your healthy ageing economy. You know, we heard things in the engagement sessions about, you know, being able to build a really strong economy around active, healthy lifestyles and ageing. You know, there's a lot of business opportunity in that as well. Next one, fostering an inclusive multi-generational community. Developing more mixed-use community nodes. There's sort of more the urgent need to provide or address affordable housing. That could be done through the redevelopment of some sort of node areas. These sort of community locations could be commercial areas going to mixed use and so on. I know there's some work being done by the town, but thinking about that sort of concept would be, I think, very potent. Obviously educational options and lifelong learning and all the things that go with that are really important. A lot of appetite for building the diversity of recreational arts and quality of life offerings, you know, really thinking about, you know, that ties to things like healthy ageing and sustainability. How do you really have, you know, a much broader suite of these desirable recreational opportunities, and that ties in obviously to tourism opportunities and so on. And then creating yourself further out as a world-class active lifestyle and healthy ageing community. You know, who's going to be the community that's going to be the best place in the world to get old in? And that'd be kind of an interesting self-interest to have. And I really do think you have the potential, but I wouldn't underestimate how long that might take. But wouldn't that be consistent with the vision of reinventing human sustainability or community sustainability? Building a connected and collaborative community fabric, providing mechanisms for building trust. And I'll talk to this a little bit more at the end. I'm not sure if you have a relative sense of your community, but you have deep levels of distrust, okay? And I'm saying that as somebody who really does care about and honours the interactions I've had with many people in this community. But I have been the one who stood in front of the 1,000 people and heard every version, okay? And there are divisions of trust between some of the different parts of the social fabric. And to call some out, obviously there are people in gated communities who feel threatened by, change. And you can see that in the data, right? But there's a distrust to where that might go. I've had the opportunity to talk to the Gullah Geechee community and heard firsthand with some passion some of their concerns about their existential crisis. You can play out a future where that cultural community becomes nothing more than a historic relic. Or you can play out a different future, which is where they become an important and prosperous part of your story and your economy and your social fabric. But to get there, you have to have some functioning level of trust. And I'll be very interested as the fly on the wall to watch how the community, starts to engage with some of the action areas, because that's where rubber hits the road. And that's where people are going to have to give a little, right? Those who don't want any change might just have to give a little bit. Those who want to race ahead and change the world may need to slow down a little bit and say, well, it's important that everybody come along on this journey. It's going to be important to say, well, if we do have some deep intergenerational, schisms, how do we continue to heal those? How do we build that, trust between, sections of our community? If you don't, you won't have any chance of fulfilling on what you see as your preferred future. Or some of you will experience that you've got it, but then others are going to be left behind. And truly a community is only as good as the people who are, the most underserved or the most marginalised in a community. All right, so mechanisms of trust. And then the sort of more to the physicality, this nodes and modes concept of building that physical locations and connectivity. I think that could be, you have already demonstrated through, some great projects in bikeways and things like that, having different layers of connectivity in a community. So playing that out and saying, how do we tie all that together and build really parallel processes, that starts to solve your transportation or congestion issues and so on. That also builds a healthy, active lifestyle where people can have different ways to be mobile between different pockets of their community and so on. And then, of course, connecting to external stakeholders is, might seem a bit random there, but if you think about your community, 40,000 people, potentially an incredible vision, some really substantial grand challenges, that there are not textbook solutions that you can pull off the shelf. Imagine if you could be the laboratory where the best thinking in the world combines to solve some of the big issues. And in this community, more than any I've ever worked in, you have threads of contact to almost anybody you want. People came from all over this country. Many people who were very successful have very strong and intact personal networks and have some heft or some gravitas you could leverage by your external stakeholders. You could become that kind of focus for a lot of very interesting dialogue and thought. So then turning to the expanding and embracing the integrated regional focus, Bluffton's not really a competitor, right? I think as the region has grown, you have to think about how do you embrace them and be part of the fabric, right? That's the first step. The next one I talk about embracing this arc of innovation. One of the things we're noticing at a sort of a developed country world level is, well, one is we're having mass urbanisation. So increasingly people, particularly millennials and so on, are concentrating in large urban centres. And what that's creating, okay, you've got that experience, that downtown sort of intensity. But as you look at radiating circles around those metropolises, and take Savannah as one of them, right? Because it's becoming an attraction point for a lot of innovation and sort of in migration. As you look around those areas, then you're seeing a lot of innovation occurring in, that's where innovation in food processing, material assembly, distribution, all that's occurring in that arc of innovation. And I would say, well, how do you plug yourself in to be part of that? You know, if you want to bring in the best and the brightest, start locally, right? So, but you've got to be tied into that system at the moment, not thinking like, oh, well, they're way over there and, you know, that's our airport, but we're never going to have anything else to do with them, right? And then, of course, to become a regional player. You know, I think this community has the chance to be a substantial player at the table, but that means you have to have the credibility and the goods to be at the table. Then the last one, which is the right-sized infrastructure. The low-hanging fruit on this is some concept like an island-scale transportation system. You know, really take all of what we've just talked about and how do you design over time like a local transportation system that jumps right ahead, right? You know, thinks about, you know, technology and where do we want to be in 5, 10, 20 and 40 years and so on. Then obviously there's a regional transportation system and then the right-sized neighbourhood locations, which we talked about. So that's that stuff, right? So roughly how we sort of laid this out in terms of a roadmap. Let me explain the structure of the diagram. Across the top are the 7 pillars. So I've had to revert to the linear sense, but we have the 7 pillars running across the top. Down the right-hand side, we have sort of like a logarithmic curve of time. So 2018, 19, 20, 25, 30, 40, right? And on the left-hand side, and it doesn't quite show up in this slide, but the background to that diagram is colour shaded, right? And it's picking up the local focus, the regional focus, and the international focus. So the idea here is, as you move forward on these key strategic pillars and build expertise and strength and so on, that's going to increase your capacity to have influence or to be reckoned with at different scales. The first thing you have to do is deal with your own local issues, right? And then obviously you can then start to say, well, let's think about our regional scale and then to our international scale. If you start at the international, the danger is you don't have the credibility to be there. You know, could you reasonably say right now that you're the epicentre for excellence on an international scale? No, it might be a wannabe, right? But, you know, to get to that point, you've got to have some street creds. You know, you've got to have some things you can point to. And we can debate the sort of the scaling, but this is really sort of what we thought would be reasonable because, you know, you have only certain number of institutions able to execute. There's only a certain amount of resources, so you have to think about how do you do this in a logical sense. So the top bar there talks about 3 big kind of issues in the short term. One is adopting the ideal of excellence, and we'll talk a little bit, you know, how that could occur. The issue of redefining sustainability and then creating the mechanisms to build trust. They're your sort of foundational building blocks, right? Low-hanging fruit, not expensive necessarily to do, but would require some, we're going to get our act together here and agree to some of these things, right? Or put in mechanisms for communication and collaboration. And then as you go down, you can see that we, you know, take those strategic action areas, the big ideas, and sort of lay these out on roadmaps. You might, I don't know, I'll be interested to hear your reaction. You may think some of this lacks ambition because I'm sort of pegging out to 2030, things like creating yourself as the epicentre for excellence, healthy ageing economy, world-class active lifestyle and healthy ageing community in an international sense, right-sized neighbourhood locations. But I think those 12 years will fly by. So to get there, if you think about the logic of what you might need to do to get there, that's sort of laid out in that diagram. And obviously you'll be able to sort of investigate that in closer detail. In the shorter term, we thought it was really important to lay out a more sort of detailed or granular action plan. These are what we think sort of realistic things that would be the logical steps. On the very left-hand side, so you can see that I've got 2018, 19. The first the extra column I put in here was the institutional steps. So there is a institutional process to follow. So obviously today is the first time everybody's getting their teeth into this. So the Vision Project Management team will need to review and consider and endorse or not the vision report. That obviously then needs to go to Town Council to adopt the vision report. And then that obviously needs to move through into actually what is your big opportunity here is the comprehensive planning process. So that's a really, that has to happen anyway. So this is a great vehicle to be able to take some of this work and implement it. Then there's other anchor public institutions. So you start to move out into those. And then obviously the property owners associations, becoming part of that, because I think, you want to slowly wrap it all together. So that's the institutional pathway. Just very quickly across there, we're talking about, the first one's adopt the ideal of excellence, the redefining sustainability, and we've talked about that in detail in the report, right? But sort of pointed to some outcomes well. And then creating the mechanisms to trust. But then after that comes some of those next sort of future building things, which is sort of the deeper thinking and planning, and then sort of starts to move through to sort of triggering some more obvious actions, in 2019. But it's aimed to tie into some of your planning mechanisms, such as comprehensive planning in the community. The big danger is, when I look at the prioritisation, everybody's very gung-ho about it. The danger is if you try and take on too much at once, you'll either crash the system, or you'll underfund things, or you'll race things, and a vision that's looking at 2040 is playing the long game. This is not a short-term fix, and if you think there are short-term fixes for some of these grand challenges, then we should have a chat afterwards, because I don't think there really are. There might be some sort of patches you could do, but to really build systemic long-term solutions will take more time. All right. My last piece, or last couple of pieces, right? So just as the consultant who's worked with you, this is the consultant's perspective, and this is flagged as such in the report. Up until now, this is really, we've been the, analysing and funneling and sort of, facilitating a process and present that in sort of a framework in the action plan, the roadmap and so on. Here's some things I would like to leave you with, right? And I say this as somebody who cares, right? So you'll see in the bottom left there's a word cloud, and that's the written responses from the question about what's the biggest threats to Hilton Head Island in 20 years. And you'll see that things like climate change, sea level, hurricanes, and the size of the word obviously is, it's more frequently repeated, are the big issues. But my observation were people were quite uncomfortable talking about that in the public workshops. Really not, it was touched on for sure, but it had the flavour to me of an area we don't want to go to, right? Well, I think we're all probably can read the data, right? And unfortunately, every forecast by whichever group it is, whether it's NASA or NOAA or anybody, right? Every forecast or analysis that comes out talks about implications of changing climate occurring faster than anticipated. I don't need to remind you you're a barrier island on the East Coast, right? So, but I do think dealing with this is actually a worthy topic, but it's also one that, if you don't, will become your existential issue. But also first in to deal with it. I mean, I could easily see you being the location that pulls a lot of experts together, and you develop best practice type approaches, because you're not the only barrier island in the world facing this issue, right? But you could be one of the ones that leads the discussion about adaptation and mitigation and so on, rather than just pretend it's not happening and then have to clean up afterwards, right? The future of the Gullah Geechee culture, I think that's really, it was quite a very heartfelt dimension to this process for myself, because, that's a very complex topic. There's a lot of factors that are driving that, but that is something that is really intrinsic to your legacy. And I know a lot of good work's going on, so I say that, right? And I do think that is a topic area to continue to work on, and find real solutions over time. And it's not going to be easy solutions, but I do believe that if that doesn't get dealt with, your island will be poorer for it. Okay, you'll be a poorer community, and you'll lack a vitality and a pride in your history. And at the level of personal individuals, there'll be people who are displaced and lose their historic home and so on. And then the last piece that I wanted to touch on was about changing the conversational focus and leaving a legacy. And I did sort of make reference to this earlier, is that I think there is going to have to be a proactive attempt from everybody to discover the way to have civil discussion. And I've stood in meetings where booing and hissing occurs, and I don't really think that is a behaviour that is going to create an environment where the original thinking can arise that you're going to need to solve some of your big issues. I think we've all had the experience of being on committees where we end up with the absolute lowest common denominator, right? And the danger is, I think, if you're a hypercritical community, and you are in that, my assessment, I say that as somebody who stands in front of a lot of communities, you're a hypercritical community, and not in a constructive sense, but in a destructive, where we're not going to respect the other view, I'm not going to listen, and I'm not going to open my mind to other alternatives that I haven't thought of. That's fine, people can conduct themselves however they want. However, the implication is that you will have declining participation, you'll have stagnation, you'll have the promise of something remarkable, but just somehow or other you never quite get there because you never get past the tennis match. And what I mean by the tennis match is polarised views. They say that, they say that, they say that, and they just amp up the intensity of that argument rather than find the way to come to a common ground. And as I said earlier, that's going to require the recognition of where I fit in that story. And if I'm the one who doesn't want change, I might have to give a little for something that's a greater shared good. And if I'm the one who's gung-ho and thinks everybody else is dragging their feet, and well, I might just have to settle down a little and take the time to explain to people why some of these changes are important. But you are a very well-versed and very educated community, and I would say that you're certainly capable of better civic dialogue. I would think that providing leadership in the community, this community, would be quite difficult. Okay? Because who wants to put themselves out with the bullseye in their back or front? Okay? But you have issues that are far bigger than your individual concerns about those topic areas, or so I'm not proposing, you're going to have to work out a lot of the solutions going forward. We've provided a framework for that. But I think the challenge, and this could be the most remarkable transformation for yourself as a community, is how do you come together and bring your passion and your deep desire and put it into a mortar and pestle environment where it becomes part of the solution, and then you have your eye on that. So they were the three sort of topic areas that I wanted to frame you with. Just a last couple of bits of data. In terms of perception around the value of the visioning process, I think this is important just to know, because it kind of points a little bit to, was this all worthwhile? And the real answer will be what you accomplished down the track, but was this process worthwhile? You can see nearly half of people are putting that as a 10 on a scale, which is, if you know anything about how people vote, that's remarkable. And then, do you think it's a good time to be exploring the future of Hilton Head Island? And we actually have 65% of people who are saying extremely good time. So I think the level of participation, obviously reflects this interest in and understanding it's a good time. If I could make a concluding comment, Sandy, is that I think we can debate the detail, obviously, right? But it's intended to be a framework. But I really applaud the community, and our work was really to design a process, make it enticing and engaging, making sure it was open and transparent, and to be able to pull the threads all the way through. And I think there's a really clear rationale and that runs right through that story. And I'm not of your community, right? But I get incredibly excited and inspired when I have reflected on what is possible, right? And you're the architects of that. You designed that. You're the ones who said, this is the kind of future we want, and these are the issues we need to deal with. And I absolutely firmly am left with the view after this process that if you just get some things, tweak some things and get those right, that you have the potential to be a remarkable example and a much needed example for communities who are wrestling with many of the same issues. But you have sort of resources and internal capability that exceed many. You have the potential to be truly that laboratory, which was a term I think that came up a lot in the engagement process, whether it's dealing with cultural fabric issues of the history and how do we make people who have lost some economic vitality, how do we make those a really key part of our society, and so on, right? So with that, Sandy, I'd just like to leave my comments there. It looks like I went on for a long time. So, but I think that the point of that is that there's an enormous depth in this story, right? And I think obviously you're going to want to read it and assimilate it. Just in terms of quick comment about next steps, obviously the Vision Project Management team is going to need to review and digest this. It's after 3 o'clock, so there should now be a survey up on the portal. So we've provided the reports on the portal, and we are inviting you to participate in a survey which is looking at and reacting to the strategic plan and the vision framework. We're assuming you're going to read it first, okay? So it's designed with some assumption about knowledge, right? But we're going to ask you to think about it and react to things like around the strategic pillars, things like your level of excitement, which of those sort of get you excited about what you could be in the future, your sense of urgency, sense of importance around those, and then at the level of the individual ideas, some sort of opportunity to prioritise those. But another key part of the survey is that for each of the strategic pillars, we're inviting you to say, how do we implement this? Imagine if the best brains in this island got together and, put in their thoughts about, in a constructive sense, about how do we implement, how do we move this forward and build that dialogue? And that's what we're going to invite you to do in that survey. So this is your first sort of crack at being able to go, okay, well, that sounds all great. I'm pretty excited about that and that. Well, don't care much about that, but the rest is good, right? Well, how do we make this happen? Okay? And this is where it gets down to real practicalities, right? And what resources and ideas can we draw in and how do we, put some rubber on the road?